have in mind today is to run through an overview of foundational concepts for understanding how the psyche and the societal process intersect in a way that for me is probably the most compelling form I've found of that. There are lots of different approaches to this question, but this one that comes mostly out of the Frankfurt School and especially the work of Habermas um, is so clear and lays out the issues so well that I found that people can really latch onto it and run with it quite a ways. And then the trick is to figure out how to link this thing that's mostly a sociological approach to the aspects of the psychological formation of subjectivity in the social and societal process. So I'm coming at this from a sort of general, what we call critical psychology approach, which critical psychology is not everyone's heard of it, especially undergraduate psychology majors these days, although it's very strong movement in the UK and Canada and Australia, South Africa, for example. But in the US, it's had a hard time penetrating into the academy. Partly because it's basically challenging mainstream psychology and its collusion with the status quo and sort of middle class liberal lifestyles and so forth. It doesn't necessarily rely on psychoanalysis as a theoretical foundation for its psychology analysis of things, but most of the more sophisticated and important approaches do draw on either object relations style stemming from Klein and Kernberg, or a Lacanian approach. Personally, I was more trained in the object relations approach, so you won't hear me talking much about the Lacanian concepts today, but there's a way to translate into that if one wants to do it. And there are quite a few of my colleagues who come from a more post-structuralist Lacanian approach to questions of ideology. Some of you mentioned reading Zizek, for example. He's obviously quite an important figure in this question of how do the psyche and society collide or intersect. And for many of us, the concept of ideology is the main useful way of talking about the problematic areas there, where subjects are formed in ways that compel them not to act in their own interests and to basically serve the social order. So are there any questions so far? I guess if you type them in there, it might be, the sound was bad for me, for many of you as you were talking, so or is it all good so far?
Yeah, clearly.
Okay,
Thank you.
good. First of all, I would say when I say psychoanalysis, I have in mind a very general sort of integrated approach to it. I don't think there's much to be gained at this level of analysis for all the infighting between the different perspectives, between Kleinians and Winnicottians and Lacanians and attachment theorists and so forth. But I think in general, these approaches have in common something that subjectivity is divided, that we are not fully aware of what our psyche is doing, and the crucial important parts of the psyche are unconscious but yet very effective in shaping the course of our awareness, ongoing symbolic semiotic process where signs and meanings are being created in very multiple ways and expressing conflicts between our own drives and desires and what the social order will permit and allow. So in an ongoing meaning making process that can be more or less guided by our own agency, depending on the level of trauma we've experienced and the kind of character structure we have. And of course, that's what psychoanalysis as a practice is all about, helping us become more agentic and more intersubjectively connected. I had sent through Julie a paper where I was looking at how the Occupy movement might be understood from a kind of psychosocial point of view. What was it accomplishing, and what kinds of things might help mobilize more people into that kind of movement. And I had gathered some people with psychoanalytic orientations to reflect on that. I'm not going to go much into that today, but that was sort of an idea about how this kind of thinking at a general level can be applied, because basically understanding social movements and why they can mobilize people or not brings us to the question of how are people psychologically constrained as they try to manage their outrage about exploitation, alienation, oppression, domination, marginalization, whatever social process they're subjected to. And in the Occupy movement itself, I was really amazed how many people were willing just to stand aside and watch as the camps went through into so many different cities in the US. And probably the same thing happens with the Indignados in Spain and the uprisings in Greece and elsewhere. That there are, what does it take to get more people to overcome their psychological inhibitions that some are realistic, just basic fear of being killed by the army, for example, but there's other things that are there too that are part of our ideological conditioning into a particular society. So let me launch into this PowerPoint here, which I imagine is going to work very well. Yes, there we go. And just talk about, I'm going to run through this fairly quickly, and I will share the, let's see, is it still there? Yeah, I put it on my Google Drive to share it with anybody who has that link. So if you want to copy it, you don't have to worry about writing down anything here. It will be, you'll be able to access it there. So basically, I want to show how modernity, especially modern society, is affecting psyches in general by using Habermas's concept of the colonization of the life world and linking that to psychoanalytic concepts, and showing how psychoanalytic reflection and action can play a role in decolonizing the life world. So we'll be defining these terms, especially life world, as we go along here. So I had this question back 20 years ago or so, having not been very well versed in sociology when I was trained in psychology. And so I started looking at, well, why do we call modern society modern? And what does modernization mean? And I was traveling then a lot in Latin America, which was very rapidly modernizing in the 80s. And I saw the impact of this large cities, especially in Venezuela, where I was at the time, developing intense consumerism and sort of the pace of life that changes and all of that. And I wanted to get to the core. What is the core thing happening there, and how is it affecting us psychologically? And so I started reading around and found that Habermas really did a good job of synthesizing many of the major sociological approaches to this. So he proposes two different concepts that interact with each other, or two different realms of human action, I guess you'd call them. The first one is system. And system has to do with what we do day to day and in our societies in order to survive physically by using natural resources of various sorts. And most of these things require using a kind of thinking that we call instrumental rationality, and communicating with others about what are we going to do and how to do it. So the values that underlie the system realm are always things like effectiveness and efficiency and productivity. If something doesn't work, we don't care about it, basically. It has to be effective. So in agriculture, medicine, engineering, military, prisons, social work, we want practices that get things done, right? That involves treating things as objects and even people as objects that are controlled. So here's, I don't know, I just have a couple of silly pictures of systems. Here's an electronic system of some sort. that makes energy go certain directions. Here's a system that keeps bombs off of airplanes as people move through security. So system in general, always, even if has to do with people, is going to be seeing things as objects that are controlled in the world for the purposes of survival and general well-being. Contrasted to that is the concept of the life world, which is sort of like culture, or if you study Bourdieu, like habitus, but this is a more active, ongoing space in which communication is happening, that is where meaning is being created, where people are trying to working to understand each other, or convince each other, persuade each other. And as opposed to in the system domain, this domain is characterized by what is called communicative rationality, where we can make claims to others based on aesthetic principles, for example, to say, this is prettier than that, or that's ugly, we can't put that out in public space, or something like that. Or expressive claims, like, I feel hurt by what you say. And this is not something that is controlling somebody directly like a physical object, but it's sharing inner worlds with each other. And then the ethical dimension, where we discuss what's right and wrong, what kind of action, behavior can we tolerate in society, or what do we want to encourage. So this is something that's fixed either. It's not like sometimes culture feels like there's this thing out there that everybody is indoctrinated into, and then we're in particular cultural spaces. But the life world is also a space for debate and revision of tradition and dialogue and consensus formation. So move on here. Here's some women in the Andes chatting in the marketplace, making life world happen, basically. Here's an image of, I guess, some Norwegian youth carrying on a tradition of folk dance. This is life world being constructed on a day-to-day basis. And it can also be more challenging the themes of the life world, for example, these protesters. So the contribution Habermas makes, along sort of integrating lots of different sociologists, as we'll see in a minute, is that he looks at the relations between system and life world. And we imagine, sort of in more what used to be called traditional societies, that life world and system were fairly integrated. And for example, imagine a harvest festival in ancient Mexico, where the rituals and sacrifices and dances and maybe songs and were interwoven with the harvest of the corn, and the production system was interwoven with the whole culture and religion. These things with modernity start to split apart, because we have urbanization, industrialization, separation of production from the domestic sphere, putting it in factories, for example, science that distances us from magic and mystical and superstitious kinds of things, bureaucracy that treats us supposedly as unique, as individuals who have no special rights because of our position, and so forth. Public education that supposedly transmits science. So Habermas argues that modernity starts to happen, in a sense, when the system starts to impose itself on the interests of the life world, where things like aesthetics, expressive interests, ethical claims are displaced or disrupted by the need to be productive and to be efficient and to get things done, or to accumulate wealth, or have military power, and so forth. So in general, modernization is said to disrupt what's called the social reproduction of the life world. And this is where we start getting to a certain psychological as well as social and cultural process. So there's some images of the early phases of the disruption of the life world, when people were put into small dwelling units, separated by nuclear families in the early industrial revolution, and children were made to work for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week in the textile mills and so forth. This is said to disrupt the reproduction of the life world because basically the life world has some complicated processes that sustain it in several different ways, several different levels. There's enculturation, social integration, and socialization. Each of these is not just a kind of mechanical process, but something that each of us lives in a very complex, unique, life historical and sociocultural manner. And if they're working well, we have these things accomplish something, like we get values and meanings and languages transmitted from generation to generation. And that's sort of what cultural anthropology looks at, right? We have social integration, which is how we get people to collaborate and live together in ways that are safe and not too destructive. And this is one thing that sociology tends to study. And then there's socialization, which is the formation of new individuals, formation of the psyche in childhood, development of identity, purpose, emotional well-being. That is the domain of psychoanalysis or psychology to some extent in general. So when these things are disrupted by the intrusion of the system into the life world, then we get these things that famous sociologists have studied. Max Weber was studying the crisis of meaning and values. Durkheim, social anomie, crime, suicide were some of his main topics, right? And then we have Freud looking at individual psychopathology and addictions and neuroses and so forth that are the domain of psychoanalytic understanding. Nice. Your plug is falling out here. Okay, so let me pause and see if you have any questions so far or concerns that are arising. Maybe type them in the chat thing and I'll try to respond before I go on. Aha. Yep. Are there more? Yeah, this is one place Habermas gets in trouble, the issue of gender, because patriarchy definitely predates capitalist modernization or even industrialization. And the usual understanding that the response from Habermasians, and there are some well-respected feminist Habermasians, or at least lean a lot on Habermas, Nancy Fraser in particular, shows how in the under-capitalist modernization, in modernity, there is a re-articulation, use of former racist and sexist practices and attitudes, and so they're re-inflected or something like that, and they're building on previous processes of patriarchy and so forth. So, and certainly religion is a zone of the life world where where certain aspects of our life world-ish, in that they're creating new meanings and new senses for people, and other aspects which can become concretized and institutionalized in ways that are oppressive and, in a sense, become part of system. For example, when they control attitudes about practices about childbirth or reproduction and things like that, building on patriarchy. So it's a complicated. Let me see. There's another question there. Yeah, so basically there are some things that are problematic in the life world itself already, and that's part of the promise of modernity that is unfulfilled. In the Frankfurt School, it makes a big deal about this, that modernity could have been this social moment when individual subjects gained full agency and participated democratically in the shaping of their society and their economy, but it became instead the basis for totalitarian and fascist kinds of organizations. And of course, they made the most, their biggest concerns being German Jews who fled the Nazi state to come to the United States and elsewhere. That was the main thing they focused on, is like, well, what happened to the potential of modernity to be democratic and make lives better for us all? Some of the other questions that are coming in here are more sort of postmodern-ish questions, like Foucault and biopower, and there's a whole reading of the same stuff as the Frankfurt School goes into from Foucault's perspective. It tends to, this is going to be kind of an overstatement perhaps, but I find that in general, where the Frankfurt School and Habermas in particular lead to a direct implication that some sort of democratic, socialist, feminist political process would be valuable, the more postmodern Foucauldian types of approaches leave that more ambiguous and worry about new forms of ideological control that might come with those kinds of political processes. So unfortunately, my specialty is not exactly in how to resolve the difference between Foucault and what's called critical hermeneutics in the Frankfurt School tradition. But there's a guy named, I'll type his name, it's Kurgler or something like that. There's a book called The Power of Dialogue. That addresses those questions for those who are interested. So thank you for your comments so far. I think I'll move on and maybe some of these questions will be answered in the process. At least we'll get the fuller layout of the theory. Because up to now, we haven't really talked about the core of this, which is, besides the disruption of the life world reproduction by modernization, there's a second wave, in a sense, of social process called the colonization of the life world. And this is where government systems and the market systems, etc., respond to social problems, what I'm calling psychosocial crises here, by implementing programs that are treating people basically like objects in order to get them to buy more things, or to fix social problems, like to reduce drug use, or to change or to make people less depressed when they go to work, or it's like the psychopharmaceutical companies and so forth. This instrumental approach to solving the social issues that are produced by modernization in a capitalist patriarchal society can't be fixed by instrumental approaches, because they are, as we said before, the life world well-being is based on intersubjective meaning making, which is requires sort of equal, well, Habermas has a whole thing about what's called the ideal speech situation, where people speak authentically to each other, they listen for understanding, they are sincere, etc. And this would be ideally what's happening in a non-colonized kind of space. Let's see this question, governmental fix. Definitely. By the way, someone just asked about the role of Marx in this, and yes, Marx is Marx's notions about alienation in particular, and the domination of social life by economic production and the relations of production are in there too, along with Weber and Durkheim and Freud. It's a key foundation for Habermas's work. And the control of bodies, yes, that's see, as I was saying, Foucault is another way of reading this kind of thing, and the whole interest in bodies as opposed to minds, I guess, comes with Foucault and feminist work of the 90s and more recently. So it's another way of saying the same thing, but the Frankfurt School was more interested in well, they still sort of had a mind-body separation of sorts, and thought about controlling the body through controlling the mind ideologically. So here's some examples of Lifeworld colonization. Obviously, advertising affects how we imagine possibilities in our lives, and things that aren't idealized by the media or advertising, we tend not to pursue. At a more literal level, Lifeworld colonization can destroy neighborhoods in order for urban progress to happen. Almost every major U.S. city I go to has an area that used to be a thriving ethnic neighborhood of some sort that was, and usually poor, and that was destroyed in order to put a freeway or or major hospital or something in that space. And then more at the level of psychology, cognitive behavioral therapies definitely have a general, although they can attend to the relationship with a client, they usually are imposing some kind of system sort of logic to sort of as if your mind was a software that needed just to be corrected in order for your behavior and feeling to be appropriate. So one way of talking about all of this is about colonization of Lifeworld is ideologization, or like the making of ideological positions. And here, there are all sorts of ways of thinking about ideology, but at the bottom of the slide, you see the John Thompson's definition that is usually known as the critical sort of definition of ideology, which that it's not only a system of ideas and images and representations, but also the practices that sustain social relations of domination. So consumerism, for example, has these three features that colonization, or if you could do this with racism, sexism, any major ideological system, basically, they have these features that the concerns of the people who are affected are neglected or silenced, that what they do is coordinated by interests that are alien to them. They're from far away, like in the original geographical colonization of like India by the British were controlling what was going on in India from a distance, and objectifying and dehumanizing the people in that colonized space. So the same thing now is we're in modern advanced capitalist societies, we have the same kind of colonization. Just another word again for control of bodies, etc., like Foucault might say. So consumerism involves several different levels. For example, there are institutional practices that make us behave like consumers. By consumerism, I mean buying more things than you actually need, because it's part of the social process that sustains the economy and so forth. So credit cards and advertising are part of that. There's a cultural level where we gain identity through material possessions as opposed to other actions. And then we have psychological susceptibility to be consumers by the fact that our status is affected by it, by our purchases, and it might be a way of dealing with depression, or we might have addictions related to consumption. There's a little image of a pretty shopping mall. And here's myself wishing I had a flat screen TV, because I'm interested in consumerism in part because of I like many people have the same struggles. Like, wow, I really want that. It looks so good, And then if I don't, I feel inferior to others who do have those things. So moving ahead quickly here, there's effects of colonization of the life world are things like the erosion of community, competitive individualism. There's a continuum of narcissism that goes all the way over to Donald Trump on one end, for those who are successful in these societies, and and anxiety and depression on the other end, as a psychological effect of colonization. In general, there's an isolation of individuals, or what's even called individualization, so that the market and advertising can get directly to a 5-year-old or a person my age, or a niche, social niche where there are particular needs that are marketed to directly, and you're basically told that this is what you have. If you're that in that niche, you need to have this thing or be this way, which totally bypasses one of the Frankfurt School's big ideas. Was that the superego that tells us sort of what life is for and what our values should be, that used to be shaped in the family structure, especially by what was known as the bourgeois father, collapsed in the 30s and 40s and was replaced by this more direct access to the drives, and so that our gratifications and our needs were shaped by what the market offered to us. So one of Marcuse's favorite concepts was that advanced capitalist society gratifies our needs so directly that, of course, we don't need to overthrow it anymore. It just gives us what we want: all the pornography, all the pleasures, whatever people might seek at these sort of lower levels, rather than sublimating, finding higher meanings. The higher and lower here is questionable, of course, but in general, it leads to a process that is actually the definition of neurosis for clinical psychologists, that basically there's a split between thought and feeling and action, that you're thinking one thing, feeling another, and doing something else. And this is essentially due to a process that makes experience not sort of unified and symbolized in a ongoing meaning-making way, but what is known as desymbolization. And desymbolization, if you want to look, there's a great author, Alfred Lorenzer, who is kind of a parallel to Lacan, in that he's working on how can we understand psychoanalysis in linguistic terms, like what's happening in language and meaning and feeling as a psychological complex is formed, for example. It's hard to find in English, unfortunately, but it's summarized in some works. Let me pause there and see if there are any more questions that come up.
This is really a great presentation. Thank you, Todd. Appreciate it.
The Sinefin model I'm not aware of. I don't know if I can look it up now. Can you? All right, thanks. It'd be hard to have an opinion right away about something. Let's see what comes up next on this. All right, so what can we do about this? This is probably the most important part. Whether we analyze the colonization of the world in terms of Foucault or Habermas or Mao or Marx or liberation psychology from Latin America or South African liberation, Black liberation politics, et cetera, this particular approach focuses on certain practices that I think coincide fairly well with many progressive and radical forms of politics, ranging from anarchists to social democratic. We'll see. Again, remember I'm a psychology professor, and I didn't learn any of this really in graduate school. It's all been self-education along the way. So please help the group here if you have insights from other studies that will help us get through this. Yeah, Dussel. Someone mentioned Enrique Dussel, he's doing a good job with this. In fact, draws on Habermas quite a bit in his book, The Philosophy of Liberation, I noticed. So yes. So what could we do to respond to the colonization of the life world? Well, in general, we want to sustain the life world against the power and control seeking of the system that is effected through the state and the corporation, basically. And how could that be done? Well, there would have to be some kind of restoration of the balance between system and life world. Their system is not a bad thing. So far, I've been talking about this horrible thing that gets on top of us and controls us and so forth. But system in general is a neutral thing, just like technology is basically neutral according to some ways of thinking about it. So we could, we need system to, for example, have agriculture that works for us and is healthy for us, or medicine that does not alienate us from our bodies, or all sorts of things that have to do with the physical world and natural processes that just need to be subjected to the interests of the life world, so that our meanings and our interpersonal relations can have a space to counter the power of the system to empower some people over at the expense of others. So basically, we're talking about a democratization of system resources, processes, etc., in response to the needs of the life, or concerns of the life world, which again are these aesthetic, ethical, and expressive concerns, like what we feel like. So let's say there's a beautiful tree on a hill that used to be a place where indigenous peoples gathered, but they want to put an apartment complex there to make more money from that land. Well, it may be effective for the system, but it's not ethical, aesthetic, or responsive to the needs of a cultural group. So that's what I mean by balance, bringing democratic process into restoring or creating ongoing between system and life world. This part gets complicated, but it's probably what you can already anticipate. What would that mean for critical practice? The first point is that what's usually seen in psychology as just personal or individual always needs to be understood as a place where the life historical, the sociocultural, and ideological processes are coming together. We need to see things like dialogue processes and self-reflection of the sort that happens in psychoanalytic therapy and deep democracy processes in communities as practices that are decolonizing. And we need to especially emphasize restoring intersubjectivity, which is sort of the thing beyond ideology. In other words, this democratic, dialogic set of practices. And doing that where there has especially been a desymbolization, a kind of silencing and controlling and a suffering from the oppression. So, for example, this is the kind of thing that basically the women's movement and the civil rights movement, gay rights movement, etc., are basically doing that. They're saying there's this place where people are marginalized, silenced, killed, etc., and they are subjects. They are people who have feelings and rights, and so this re-symbolizing process restores the history that they've experienced, builds bonds between them and with others, builds general social understanding of what the suffering has been. And to some extent, all of this echoes a liberation psychology kind of approach. Some of my work became familiar with that in my travels in Latin America, and I was briefly a friend of Ignacio Martín Baró before he was killed. So I'm echoing a lot, especially the importance of recuperation of historical memory as part of the process of re-symbolization for decolonization. Just about to wind up here. So linking this more to psychoanalysis, basically what does psychoanalytic dialogue do? It creates meaningful connections and new narratives, etc., relating different parts of the self that have been split off or dissociated, and others who have been objectified or only partially viewed as full humans. And here I find Kernberg pretty good at talking about how we need to have a process of de-idealization, re-symbolization, differentiation of self objects from other objects that have been internalized. It's complex stuff, but I think the main point is that any form of psychoanalytic practice, which is engaging the subject in reflection on the unconscious urges, impulses, desire, etc., and how that shows up in life wishes and in the present, and also in the transference in the therapy, is a model. It's a sort of a prototype. One reason I'm so interested in psychoanalysis is that it's a prototype for the sorts of things that communities can do. So I'm seeing a question here. How do you begin to rest inside the clinic? Yeah, the clinical, as I was just saying, there are ways of doing clinical work which echo these understandings, and probably the main problem in mainstream clinical work is that if someone came in saying, "Oh, I'm really worried now about the rise of the political right in Europe or North America, and people like Trump, and there might be a sort of, okay, now let's get down to work. Once you've said that, let's get down to work on what's going on with your relationship or in your workplace or something." That would be shrinking back to the personal level, the individual level, separated from the larger social context, or looking at I'm trivializing a bit here, but looking at attitudes toward Donald Trump as projections of what their feelings toward their father or something like that. But there are forms of therapy that are called critical counseling, critical psychotherapy, critical psychoanalysis, and there's a new collection called Critical Counseling, Psychotherapy, and Psychoanalysis that came out of England last year that you can find, and it addresses many of these things. Andrew Samuels is one author who's a Jungian in his approach, but it makes it pretty clear that political issues that arise in therapy are worth addressing for not just for their individual meaning, but because it's part of helping us collectively get more people who are engaged politically and who are not just passively experiencing things. So let me read a couple more comments here. Resymbolization in Chiapas. Yeah, so it's interesting that many of the current forms of resymbolization at a community level are being shown to us by very marginalized groups. The work of Mary Watkins in a book called Towards Psychologies of Liberation collects a lot of these, and really especially emphasizes the importance of having what's called a public home place as a place for gathering and dialoguing and re-symbolizing, connecting with history, speaking about various forms of oppression and suffering that have been experiencing solidarity, basically decolonizing. And it becomes immediately, as the examples you're mentioning, the Kurdish women in Chiapas. There are, Mary Watkins works in Southern California, and she's been studying people who are challenging the border, the Mexican-U.S. border relations. So those are, you're all, sounds like you're getting the point here that you can imagine a more social, community level version of psychoanalysis that is empowering, liberating, etc. Of course, then the Occupy movement itself, in the some of the processes that were happening in the camps of Occupy were clearly forms of, like I said in my article, where people for the first time were heard by somebody else, and or even recognized as existing in their societies. This is an amazing, powerful experience for someone who's been, houseless or unemployed or just not connected, or even people who have had no participation in the democratic political process before. So my bottom line here is the sort of these several levels: critical self-reflection, which is kind of a code word for psychoanalytic inquiry; intersubjectivity through dialogue, and I mean not just sort of political debate, I mean slowing down groups of 15, 20, 30 people in circles, reflecting, sharing deeply, following the guidelines of a facilitator for listening carefully, working to understand each other, then building from that toward democratic political structures that empower communities in relation to the power of the state or the marketplace, to eventually challenge what I call here corporate consumerist globalization, which seems to be the main global process now.